USAID is very proud of the fact that they do provide democracy, human rights, and governance programming that is trying to strengthen democratic actors abroad, that is trying to strengthen reformers who are trying to break down corrupt systems of governance, that are strengthening and protecting the rights of minority groups within countries. We have done that work for a long time. But let me be clear, USAID is not in we are not in the job of fomenting coups. We are not in the jobs of undermining duly elected leaders.
So, Connor, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Would you be able to briefly tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and what you did at USAID until recently?
Sure thing. As you know, my name is Conor Savoy. I am currently on administrative leave at USAID, where I was the team lead for foreign policy engagement within the agency's Bureau for Planning, Learning, and Resource Management. My team was primarily responsible for the agency's engagement with the National Security Council at the White House. And so we covered national security and foreign policy priorities for the agency, ensuring that you had a strong voice of global development in issues, national security and foreign policy issues that had, that had an impact on a direct impact on global development. So we worked a lot on global infrastructure. We worked on countering the People's Republic of China, Global Fragility Act, which deals with fragile countries, and some other issues. Besides USAID, I also have a background in think tanks in Washington. I worked for a number of years at the Center for Strategic and International Studies as a senior fellow, and I've also done aid advocacy for more effective foreign aid.
Right on. That is a awesome background. I'm a
Thank
big
you.
fan of CSIS, by the way. I love
Yeah,
their podcasts, especially.
yeah, they have a great podcast series.
Cool. So while you mentioned vulnerable countries, are there any specific countries or populations that you can think of off the top of your head that are like prime targets for Russia and China to swoop in?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I would say to that. I think there are areas in which the United States over the past several years have been making inroads, and in particular, if I talk about where we've been looking at support for global infrastructure programs, and those are countries like the Philippines, um, Southern Africa, so Angola, Zambia, DRC, um, and Central Asia, the Central Asian republics. And so, you know, I think a lot of people are aware that the United States has not traditionally provided a lot of direct support for infrastructure development. We have pockets of it here and there within the government, but not really a coordinated effort. And over the last several years, there has been an attempt to bring a more coordinated lens. And that's an area where I think right now we don't know what's going to happen with that work. It's very much in limbo. But those are good examples of areas where China already spends a lot of money on infrastructure. They can very easily come in and say, look, you can't trust the Americans. They say they're trying to offer you an alternative. Well, their alternative is not credible. It's not a credible counteroffer to what we can provide you. So why would you go with them? And I think we're still trying to kind of see what happens with that. Um, I think we've also seen anecdotally, we have seen um, global health implications. So the US is one of the largest, if not the largest donor in the global health space. Everything from PEPFAR to which covers HIV and AIDS to malaria to neglected tropical diseases, child and maternal health, so on and so forth. We spend, nearly a third of our aid budget every year is on global health. And we are already seeing areas where we have reduced or canceled spending, where China has come in and offered uh, new funding to cover what we pulled. And I know of at least an example in Cambodia, in Malawi, and in Uganda, where China is trying to fill that void now. And we're going to lose ground in those countries. And more broadly, we're going to lose ground elsewhere. I mean, just in terms of our credibility, who's going to trust us if we're trust our word going forward that we're actually going to meet our obligations if we say we're going to fund a program. So you've really, those are some areas I think, if you're thinking a little bit more too, I mean, where Russia is, and I think this is a good example of an area where we were starting to do a lot more thinking, but now this has been ended, is Russia plays much more of a spoiler role in a lot of these contexts. They're in more limited areas. They tend to be more in fragile countries like the Central African Republic or like the Sahel in West Africa, where governance is weak. There tends to be armed actors that insurgencies that the Russians exploit through things like the Wagner Group, where they come in to provide security in exchange for often corrupt deals, where they're getting control of a mine or some other kind of economic asset that the country pledges to essentially pay for the services of the Wagner Group. We, I think, we had begun to look at this as a particular challenge that was separate and distinct from that of which the Chinese pose in developing countries. And if you look at an area like the Sahel, the withdrawal of our foreign aid in countries like that will mean reduced resilience from drought and other climate-related events, which is going to lead to greater displacement, which will fuel insurgencies in a lot of instances or create new ones. So that's going to cause a lot more, and it's going to just create spaces that Russia can further exploit. And that's going to be a real challenge. And I think the challenge, in particular, in a place like the Sahel, is it borders countries that are largely stable. So, for example, coastal West Africa, if you look at Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, these are stable. They're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but there could be serious spillover effects from bordering countries like Mali, Niger, Chad, and others where we are seeing an increased Russian presence.
Interesting. And so while we're on the subject of the West African countries, what are the prospects of those countries allowing the French to come back in to step into the role that the USA is now kind of abandoning?
So I think one of the challenges for a lot of these countries is it's not just the US that's cutting its foreign aid budget right now. You actually see similar trends in other traditional bilateral donors. So France, Germany, the UK, Japan, a number of the traditional G7 bilateral donors are also cutting their assistance. And so it's going to be very difficult for really anybody to pick up the slack. There may be some limited ability for a country like France, for example. They may, in some countries like Cote d'Ivoire or Senegal, where they have the colonial relationship or the former colonial relationship, they may pick up some slack, but their ability to do so is very limited. And I think if you're looking at what's happening right now as well, where Europe is saying they're going to increase defense spending, that's going to create other pressures within their budgets. And so you may see further cuts by other European bilateral donors, and that's just going to have a further impact. And again, it's going to create a space. China is not really, they do not provide the same level of assistance that we do on the same types of programs and sectors. So that still remains very much seen if they decide to pick up the slack, like for example, in all across global health or in all the countries where you're seeing less of an American presence. So I do think it's a very scrambled. It remains a very it's going to be scrambled for some time to really see how this all shakes out ultimately. Who, if anyone, really is able to step in, and I think that's the challenge. There may not be other actors, either governments or philanthropy or multilateral players who actually can step in. And so there may just be a whole slew of things that just go away. And that's, I think, the real fear that I have and others have. That's going to create a lot of disruption, a lot of death, increase in poverty, and things like that.
Gotcha. And so in terms of the, damage that's already been done, let's say Marco Rubio decides tomorrow that he completely has changed his mind on USAID as a whole, or maybe the current uh, judicial proceedings that are taking place, maybe they rule that USAID needs to be restored. How feasible is it to, revive the corpse?
In the short term, I mean, there's always a chance that you could. provide it. But I really want to underscore that it's not a light switch, right? Like you can't just flip it on and then flip it off and then flip it back on, and expect things to go seamlessly. I mean, there has been a tremendous amount of disruption, not just within USAID itself, but across the entire development ecosystem. So implementing partners who are how we spend most of our aid dollars. So for-profit contractors like Chemonics or DAI, large INGOs like FHI 360 or Save the Children or others, they've furloughed thousands of staff. Contracts have been terminated. There is a whole sort of slew of administrative action that has to take place with all these terminated contracts. Penalties have to be assessed and paid. People are moving on. A lot of staff have started to think about what is their next step. I also think there's a lot of folks who may feel like they don't want to go back necessarily, given the way in which they've been treated, given the fact that they've essentially been, denigrated as not as un-Americans, as people who are working against the American interest. When, quite frankly, that is what everyone who works at AID gets up every day and does, is to work in the American interest, deliver programming and projects that are meant to safeguard this country. Um, so I think it maybe in the short term, but the longer you go, the more difficult it is. You're not going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again at this point, ultimately. There is a chance that perhaps you can salvage something under the State Department at this point. But even that, it's not simply like you can't just pick something up at aid and plug it into the State Department and expect it to work. They use different payment systems. There's different IT systems overall. State is not a programmatic agency, meaning they aren't used to developing contracts, issuing contracts, doing the whole RFP process, and then providing the oversight that's needed. They're going to have to develop that, and some of it may be able to be pulled over. Some of it won't be, and it's going to be. I think it's going to be. We're in for a messy process. I would say at least for the next year or so.
Gotcha. You briefly touched on something that I was actually going to bring up, which is
Yeah.
the accusations and the criticism that some people have had about USAID, and specifically, hearing things like, the left was peddling their own agenda and using USAID as a way of doing that, or maybe specific people in, the government were using it to enrich themselves at the taxpayers' expense. How would you respond to those accusations?
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand where these accusations come from. I think there's almost zero credibility to these types of accusations. Ultimately, at the end of the day, and I've said this to others, but foreign aid is one of the most, if not the most scrutinized part of the federal budget. Um, Congress provides significant direction within the annual appropriations bill for state and USAID. They provide significant direction in terms of where the money will be spent, what it will be spent on, how it will be spent. Um, and we have very little ability to deviate from that. So when I hear the accusation, for example, that we're spending money on that USAID has become a quote unquote global charity, the reason why we're spending the money is where we are spending is because of Congress. It's not because people at USAID got up and said, well, let's spend $800 billion or $800 million a year on global water programs. It's because members of Congress inserted a spending directive into the appropriations bill that says we must spend $800 million on global water, or we must spend $1 billion on basic education, even though we have consistently told Congress that we don't have $1 billion worth of basic education projects to spend that money on. Um, yes, we have leeway in project design and things like that. Yes, different administrations have different foci. So, yes, the Biden administration felt like USAID should spend money on climate programs. Well, they asked for that money. That money was appropriated by Congress to support climate programs. The previous Trump administration, quite frankly, spent money on climate programs through USAID. I understand that We use different terminology. If you talk about like women's and girls versus gender programming, we use different terminology. But ultimately, at the end of the day, previous Trump administration also wanted to spend a lot of money on gender programming. The first daughter, Ivanka Trump, was a champion for programming that targeted women and girls. So I just find it very laughable to think that that people at AID, that bureaucrats, unilaterally made these decisions. We did not. These decisions were made for us largely by Congress, including Republican members of Congress, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who for many years was a supporter of the work that USAID did. Did he agree with everything that the agency did? No. But overall, he saw the value in it and he understood the role that Congress played.
Interesting. Going back to your example of, say $1 billion appropriated by Congress for education programs in a situation where you're telling them, hey, we don't have $1 billion worth of education programs to carry out. And when that happens, do you have to, because the money has already been appropriated and has to be spent, were there situations where programs that maybe weren't efficient were made up to, use the excess funds?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not, you don't make programs up, you don't make projects up. I think what you ultimately do is there is some amount of, Congress does give us some amount of what's called deviation authority. So we can redirect a certain amount of funding toward other projects. And that's often what we did. And we would, in consultation, to be very clear, we would have to notify Congress. We would send them a notification that said, we are taking X number of dollars of appropriated basic education money, and we're going to reprogram it toward X type of program. Do you concur? And then Congress has to say yes or no. And they have the ability to hold a congressional notification, for example, if they don't agree with what we're doing with the money, or if they want to ask further questions or have a further briefing on what it is we actually intend to do with the money. Um, and I think over time we've certainly found ways in which we could work with Congress to sort of better direct some of the earmarks, some of the spending directives that they had. And I mean, again, it is a give and take. I don't want you to think that there isn't a certain level of we talk to them, they consultation, we go back and forth, we come back with something that happens all the time. But certainly, I want to be very clear. There was never nobody would say like, oh well, let's just make up a project to spend this money. We always had sound projects that we could spend the money on. It just sometimes you had to seek a little bit of additional guidance or input from Congress to kind of readjust where you're spending those dollars.
I see. And so when it came to the decision being made on which projects were going to be cut and which projects would be folded into the State Department, um, the administration claimed that what they were doing was essentially looking at which programs were, inefficient, wasteful, or whatnot, and cutting those. On the other hand, from speaking to other USAID workers, they said it was more of a throwing darts at a board and seeing what it hits when it comes to what was being cut. What was your, experience of how the cuts were made?
I mean, it's very much the DART approach. I mean, let's be frank with you. Let me be frank with you for a second. So, I think they claimed that they reviewed something like 8,300 contracts or something along those lines, and then determined that 5,300 that in a period of relatively short period of time. I don't believe that they fundamentally looked at each and every contract and grant that USAID had and made that kind of determination. I think ultimately what they did was they did a control F search for certain words like gender, like climate, other words that they don't like, and then just decided, oh, well, we'll cancel that contract or we'll cancel that grant because that's a gender thing. Now, I'll give you two very clear examples. One is our infrastructure. Infrastructure program. So we have what's called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGI. We had a small amount of money for it. We had a contract that was given to a global infrastructure company that was going to provide essentially advisory services for different infrastructure projects around the world. They terminated that contract. Why? Probably because there were references to climate and gender within the original contract, because those were things that would potentially be incorporated, or types of analysis that might be incorporated into an infrastructure project. That project is designed, PGI is designed to counter and provide a credible counteroffer to China's Belt and Road, which is something that Republicans on the Hill have consistently said the US government should be in the job of countering. I mean, that's a really solid example of where I think it really went quite haywire. I also know that our other counter PRC programs, a lot of the contracts for those were terminated as well. And again, why? Largely because they may have had the word climate or gender or human rights or some other thing that they didn't like. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the core goal of those projects was to counter some kind of malign influence from the People's Republic of China in our partner countries.
Interesting. And so on the topic of countering influence and using USAID as a tool for influence, um, this might get a little into the conspiratorial side, but I have some classmates who wanted me to ask. There have been allegations that the USAID has been used as a means of either sabotaging or influencing things like elections abroad. I believe one of them brought up the example of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh once upon a time and things like that. Is there any uh, truth to those accusations?
No, there's no truth to those accusations, and I understand that. I think, look, there is suddenly a tremendous amount of disinformation and misinformation out there. I think that there was a guy who went on Joe Rogan's show and talked about how USAID is a front for the CIA, and how we do exactly what you were just saying, that we would undermine countries that we didn't like, or undermine leaders that we didn't like with our programming. Look, USAID is very proud of the fact that they do provide democracy, human rights, and governance programming that is trying to strengthen democratic actors abroad, that is trying to strengthen reformers who are trying to break down corrupt systems of governance, that are strengthening and protecting the rights of minority groups within countries. We have done that work for a long time. But let me be clear, USAID is not in we are not in the job of fomenting coups. We are not in the jobs of undermining duly elected leaders. That is not what USAID does. What we try to do is we try to support democratic reform. We try to support good governance. We try to ensure that people's rights are respected, as we would want our own rights to be respected. Um, and I think the challenge that we have is that, as I said, there is a tremendous amount. All of a sudden, over the last several months, there has been a spike in the amount of disinformation and misinformation out there about what USAID does. We are a tool, and have always been a tool, of US foreign policy. We are trying to reinforce and strengthen our foreign policy and national security abroad. I mean, take PEPFAR, for example. It saves lives, and it reduces the rates of HIV/AIDS infection in countries that are not necessarily the most stable in the world. And you see spikes, you see more death, you see more things. You can undermine the stability of those countries. It's not just it's not just you know a moral. We're not doing it just for moral reasons. We do derive real foreign policy and national security benefits from that type of work. And we've seen that. I mean, this is in the bones of what AID is since our founding in the early 1960s during the Kennedy.
Gotcha. So, given the current climate with international development, mainly the cuts to USAID, but as you were mentioning, there's been a decrease in funding for international development across the board around the globe. What advice would you give to a, young professional looking to get into the international development space?
Yeah, I mean, I think I get it. We are really kind of facing a real. I mean, the industry, the sort of you know lowercase I industry of development is going to undergo a fundamental shift. But I think that there's still a lot of good opportunities out there. People can work for the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the African Development Bank. There's a lot of great UN agencies that do work in the space: UNDP, UNICEF, World Food Program, FAO. All of these great agencies. And I think there's still going to be a lot of work for NGOs. There's going to be a lot of work um, for different organizations that are trying to make an impact on the ground, that are trying to reduce poverty, save lives, um, help people get access to better education. Um, I think, unfortunately, this within the United States for the short term, it's going to be very disruptive, and it's going to be challenging. But I also would still urge people to see this as something noble, as something that is a good an area where I think you can do a lot of good in the world. It may be a little bit harder. It may take a little bit more time, but I would certainly urge people to continue to see this as a great field. If you are called to public service, international development, working abroad, working to make people's lives better is a great career and opportunity.
Awesome. Well, those are most of the questions I have. Was there anything that you wanted to discuss? Anything I should have asked you about while I've got you here?
No, those were very comprehensive questions. So no, I think we covered it. Best of luck with this. I think it's a night. I'm glad that you're interested in trying to tell the story. And so, yeah, if there's follow up or anything, please let me know.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Connor. I'm going to end the recording here.